Hello, friends. Let's begin with a little disclaimer. I'm going to be, in this video, discussing sex and sexuality, frankly, but not, hopefully, offensively. If this is a topic that makes you uncomfortable or that you are triggered by in any way, I invite you, please, to stop watching now. Please do not watch the whole thing and then leave me long, angry comments about how offensive and or unsafe this made you feel. I will delete them, and you will not feel heard, and we can all save ourselves some frustration by just not watching a video that you do not find yourself interested in or that makes you feel unsafe. And if you are not old enough to be engaging in sexual activity, I also invite you not to watch this until the law says you are an adult. Who else should not watch this? I don't know. People who are purists when it comes to reading in any particular system. I think that's it. So go ahead. No harm done. You are still a wonderful human being. I will pause. All right. So we're going to talk about tarot and sex. Now, I started to script this video, but that's not really my style. And I found it very constricting. So, as I tend to do, I'm going to speak off the cuff. Cut. I'm going to be speaking off the cuff, is the phrase I'm trying to reach for there. And already doing a good job, as you can tell. I think that this is an important topic. I think that sex is something that has been left out of pretty much every tarot book that I learned with. And this became a topic of conversation with a friend the other day who did a reading for someone, and they asked me my thoughts, and they said, there's a lot of wands in this relationship reading. Why do you think that is? And I said, I think it's because it's about sex. And they said, oh, that's a fair point. Like, I never really thought about it that way. And I said, I think about it that way all the time. I have come to think of it that way all the time. So what we're going to talk about today is reading cards where the topic might end up being sex. How do you know, potentially? And what cards might indicate that we're dealing with sexuality, human sexuality? And in what contexts might certain combos of cards tell you about sex? So, I hope this is interesting for you. We're going to dive right in. I am going to try to be a little more of an editing wizard in this video than I normally am. So I'm going to try to have the card images, rather than doing like the PowerPoint or having face down at the table. I feel like this is a very personal topic, this kind of thing, and we need to get as intimate as we can. So I wanted to show my face in this one. I also, you'll notice I'm not wearing my glasses, because as someone pointed out to me, when I wear my glasses, you can't see my eyes because of the glare. So... again, I decided in this video, it's probably important for us to see each other. Well, I can't see you. Or can I? So yeah, how do you know when a reading might be about sex? What combinations of cards might tell you that sex is an issue in some way? And we'll just chat about some things that pop into my head about like what that means in a reading. Sound good? So let us begin with how you know a spread of cards might be talking about sex specifically, or that it might be an issue within the reading. And the first thing I would say is that, like everything else, it's going to depend on the question. If the question was about relationships, romantic relationships specifically, or in some way relates to relationships, that ups the chances that a reading would be sexual in some way, that I would have some subtext or overtext of sexuality at play. That would be my first clue, honestly. If this were a work reading, it would be much more difficult for me to find sex in a spread because of the context. Now, we all know that stuff happens at work. Not to me, but I've heard. So... I could find it there. We could find it there, but it would be a bigger reach, as it were. I am probably going to say a lot of things that are going to be punny in this video. Another reason why, if you are a prude, you probably should not stick around, because this is a serious thing, but it's also, frankly, a funny thing. I mean, it is something that we joke about as children, and we don't really outgrow that for a lot of us. And I think a lot of that has to do with why tarot doesn't, or a lot of books that I learned tarot on don't talk about sexuality, and because in the United States, it is something we don't like to talk about. So, yeah, so the first thing I would say is I would always look to the question, if it's a relationship reading, there's a romantic relationship reading, probably there's going to be sex in there somewhere, depending on the context. And if there's not, that's actually an interesting clue too. Like, if there are no sexy cards in the spread, might that actually be something that is a purpose for the reading? Is that something that may need to be explored by the querent? It might be. It happens. So I would say the question certainly matters a lot. And that's always the case. I mean, when it really comes down to it, like, the question to me is so fundamental. Now, suppose it were a general reading. Suppose it was a Celtic cross, say, and you were curious about whether sexuality was at play in the context of the reading. Then it would probably depend on the context of the cards, certainly. But it's harder to do, in a Celtic cross, for example, to kind of know contextually what the individual cards are referring to specifically. Which is one reason why I don't love that spread, particularly for folks who are starting out. I think that there are more manageable and more useful ways of reading for someone starting out. But again, that's me. Like, people swear by that spread and they love it, and I'm going to get hate mail because I dissed the Celtic cross. In a general reading, I would look at themes. So even if you are doing a general reading where all of the cards are read individually, and really a reading like that, to me, like the Celtic cross, is 10 one-card readings. But then, because it is one spread, you are able to, at the beginning or the end or throughout or all of the above, look at themes in the spread. And so if there were a lot of sexy cards in that spread, that might be something you would consider in your interpretation of the whole picture, of the whole event of the reading. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't bring it up. If it were something where I was reaching too far, grasping at straws for something like that, I don't. It's not like, and I don't want it to make it sound like all my readings are about sex. They're not. You know what I mean? It comes up as much as anything else does. Most of my readings tend to be about, what do I do with my life? How do I get this book off the ground? Or, that's the kind of things people usually ask me. I think over the years I've made it clear that I like doing relationship readings, and so I've been getting more of those lately. But even then, they're not always about sex. And I guess that's the other thing, is like, let's not go crazy and make every reading about that. You have to read the cards in context. And so that's the third. Is it the third? The question, overall themes, and the cards in context. And so we're going to talk in a hot minute, about cards, sexy cards, as I call them, but cards that might indicate sex or sexuality. One of those in a spread probably does not indicate anything other than its normal sort of whatever it would mean in the context. But if there are a lot of them in a spread, then that is another thing for you to consider. That's kind of the same thing as looking at themes. I don't use, like, for a general reading, I don't necessarily use a Celtic cross-like spread. I love my 9-card square or rectangle, or the Council of 13. Those are two that I really find useful. And the reason that I like those is because I have a lot of cards to work with, and so I can sort of see, there's a lot of sexy cards in this spread. It's a sexy little spread, so it's going to be a sexy reading. So it's like, it's the question, it's the themes in the reading, and the number of sexy cards that you find. So, and your intuition. Intuition is a thing that is, like, super controversial to bring up, but there are times where you just might get this sensation that this is a particularly sexually driven reading or situation that you're reading about. And that is something you should pay attention to. You should pay attention to those intuitions. It doesn't mean that they're right all the time. How do you know if you're right? You find evidence in the spread. That's another reason why I like those kind of 9-card box spreads or whatever, because you are able to come up with a thesis, as I talk about this all the time. Isn't it repetitive? But these are hard-earned lessons, and I'm very proud of them, and I think they can help. In a large spread, even the Celtic Cross, if you want to look at it that way, you come up with a thesis, and then using whatever. So when I do a 9-card spread, I've talked about this before. Hey, Tom Benjamin, try to put a picture in here of this. When I do a 9-card, usually I will start with the middle card first and then go top left and then do the rows. And so those 2 cards, the middle and the top left, are my thesis. They give me the theme. And what that allows me to do is use the rest of the cards as evidence to support that thesis. And if it doesn't support that thesis, then it's back to the drawing board. Usually it does. Usually I get my answer from those first 2 or 3 cards, and then the rest of it is just elaborating and supporting my thesis. But that is why I like a spread like that. And you could use the Celtic Cross that way by saying the center 2, the card and the cross, are the thesis, and everything else in the reading supports that, in addition to serving as environment or hopes and fears or whatever. So, to summarize this little section, how do you know a reading is involving sex or sexuality? The question, if it's a relationship question, chances are that there's going to be more likelihood of sexuality appearing, because sexuality is part of romantic relationships often. Themes in the spread, like the Celtic Cross, if you see a lot of sexy cards in the Celtic Cross or whatever, and also the number of sexy cards you see in a spread might be indications, and of course the voice, the skill within, that tells you that any reading is about anything. Now, what are sexy cards? That is going to depend a whole hell of a lot on the way that you read and the way that you view cards. For me, they vary, but there are some that frequently, more often than not, have an element of sex to them. And the biggest ones would be the Devil and the Tower in the trumps. Those, to me, especially in combination, actually, frequently will indicate some kind of sexuality, human sexuality. Certainly the explosiveness of orgasm is represented in the Tower. If you're looking at the image, of course, that's a very male-centric view, but I think the experience of a really, mind-blowing orgasm could be represented for anybody. It doesn't necessarily have to indicate ejaculation. So I think the Tower, definitely. The Devil certainly has that, and partly because I do tend to view that card as a sort of a pre-Christian idea of the devil, of the pagan gods, the bacchanals, the bacchanalias. Bacchus is the god I'm trying to reach for there. A very primal, deep animal quality. That is a part of the Devil for me. Now, remember that all cards have light and shadow, so that could also be addiction, certainly sex addiction, if the cards suggested it. The Moon is a very sexual card to me, certainly very feminine sexuality, or, I really wish we could find ways to talk about these binaries without resorting to gender, but that's what I have, that's the language I have to work with right now. Feminine sexuality, receptive sexuality, allure, pull. If you think about what the moon does to the ocean, that is very sexual energy. And so the Moon has that. Those 3 in the trumps principally do it. Death can indicate sexuality. There is an old Victorian term, little death, that was another term for an orgasm. And so that can, in some instances, represent sex. Again, this all depends on how you read. I think the Empress and the Emperor in partnership in a reading can indicate a sexual couple or a sexual attraction. They, again, don't necessarily represent the genders depicted on the card, but as a couple in the trumps, they have that quality of being a pair, of being partners, of being partners in many ways, but partners certainly sexually. And again, the other cards in the reading or the question are going to tell you that. Why the Empress and the Emperor specifically? They represent fatherhood and motherhood in the Trumps, certainly. They are two parts of the same thing. They represent a pair, a couple, commingling. They have the same job as, in their way, so that's a thing. And so in that regard, they are the sexual partners of the deck. Some people may choose the Magician and the High Priestess, say, and that makes equal sense. And the Magician, to me, has a much more individual sexual energy, and the High Priestess, to me, has a withholding energy. And so that, to me, doesn't necessarily say sexuality as a couple, but certainly they're there. And that might be something you think about. The Hermit, I think, specifically would represent masturbation. And this was one of the things that was a part of the conversation that inspired this video. And I said it jokingly, but actually I really do mean that. And that is a valid human sexuality. It is something that probably won't show up in a lot of readings, but certainly could, and so I think that is something that is worth having in your toolbox, your toolkit, that card could represent that. What other cards in the deck? Certainly the Suit of Wands as fire. Now, it's tempting to sort of go to the penis joke there, but it's not, to me, the reason why, although it could be, certainly in a reading about a man or centering on male sexuality, male identifying sexuality. But the thing about the wands specifically as a suit that is sexual is that they are the fire suit. They're hot. They're steamy, they are absolutely passionate, and so in that sense, a lot of wands in a spread can indicate a lot of different things, but in context might indicate sexuality, human sexuality. The Court of Wands, certainly. You have, in a sense, sort of the virgin in the page, the sexual experimentation of your teens in the night, the development of and nurturing of sexuality in the Queen, and then dominant sexuality in the King, and you can look at that in different ways too. And certainly all of that crosses and embraces all gender experiences. So the whole Suit of Wands certainly has a very passionate sexual vibe to it. The Suit of Cups in combination with the Suit of Wands, to me, absolutely has sexual energy. I called the wands steamy earlier, but their steam only really comes from fire and water. And so the union of wands and cups, being a lot of wands, a balance of wands and cups that are really dominant in a spread, might indicate sexuality. And that would be a sexuality that's more emotional. So it's, the fire alone sort of spreads and goes where it wants to, and it doesn't really have boundaries. Fire and water come together, and they force consequences, and the consequences is steam. But we have the added benefit of water that cools it a little bit, and may make it a little bit more emotional than just all that fire. That gesture definitely is going to make people laugh. Those are cards that I think have that. Now, again, I'm going to repeat this over and over and over again. The context matters. Not every reading containing a lot of wands cards is about boning. It is in the context of a question. And so now we put those things together. And that'll be sort of Act 3 of this conversation. So just to sort of sum up really quickly, the cards that to me represent human sexuality in context are the Tower, the Devil, the Moon, the Empress and the Emperor, certainly, and the Hanged, not the Hanged Man. Although I guess, punchline here, the Hanged Man might be a punchline in a reading. The Hermit for individual pleasure. And the Hermit, not just masturbation, but also a selfish lover, for example. Someone who is only interested in or only manages to take care of themselves and actually is not capable of pleasing someone else. So there's that element, right? So those in the trumps, and then in the minors, certainly the Suit and Court of Wands has a sexual energy, and the Court of Cups, or the Suit of Cups when paired with the Suit of Wands. Yes, the Suit of Wands. And things that I like to look for in context, which is the next part of this, are things like how balanced the spread really is. You know what I mean? If there's a nice balance of Wands and Cups, that's probably like a really good even keel for a relationship to be at. If there's an imbalance, if there are more Wands than Cups, that could represent many things, again, depending on the situation and what you know and all of that. It could represent that this is a new relationship and that lust and passion are really sort of key players, but there's an emotional element in there it's flowing in, but it's not as strong, which is not uncommon in a new relationship. The reverse might be true in a longer term relationship, or a relationship where sex is less important to the players. And so if there are more cups than wands, the emotions play a bigger part, and may, for example, represent people who can't really experience sexual pleasure without emotion, which is not uncommon as well. So I think that the balance is key. Obviously, it's rare that you're going to have a reading that's all only those two suits. And so how do they play with other things? If it's a reading about sex and sexuality or relationships, and the mind comes in, the swords come in, then there might be a lot about intellectual stimulation, and so you think about stimulation in multiple ways there. If there's pentacles involved in the equation, that might actually be about starting a family. So you think about the context, you think about the question, you do all of those things that I always talk about, but those cards really matter. They don't really matter. Those cards really feel like they have that energy. The Ace of Wands and the Ace of Cups, certainly, for what's the word I'm looking for? Binary sexuality, male and female sexuality, can be represented by the Ace and the Ace of Cups and Wands. The Two of Wands and the energy of twos drawing. I think any two card can have that energy because twos attract. And threes can be, I'm sorry, I'm adding this back to the conversation about which cards. Threes can also be, but threes are like the result of the encounter. So if twos are attractive, they attract and repel. Threes are the result of what happens after the attraction. So when the two things are drawn to each other and there's an intercourse, so to speak, the three is often the result of that. It's the child of the event. It's the child of the experience. So threes in their way are like the morning after, so to speak, or what happens next. Tried very hard to avoid saying what comes next there, and I just called myself out for almost doing it. But again, that's just me. You're gonna have to work within your system. There's no prescription for this. You have to trust what you know about the cards. But these are things I think generally for me that I have picked up on over the years, that I've experienced, and also things that just make sense given the way that I read. If twos for you are not about attraction, if threes are not about growth or the result of an interaction, then that doesn't make sense, right? So yeah. So then we get into like context and combinations. And just to sort of return to an initial point, which was like, not everything is about this, and be thoughtful about how you're approaching it. How do you start to sort of get the sense that there might be things going on? Well, in a relationship, to me, a relationship reading, I actually often think the devil is a good sign, but if it were with, say, the Eight of Swords, I would need to think about what that combination means. Is someone trapped in a sexual relationship, or is someone getting kinky? And so I need more than just those two cards, So if it's the, what did I say? The devil, sorry, this is why I like to do visual aids beforehand. But I will do them afterhand, which is not an expression. If it's the devil and the Eight of Swords, and it is followed by the Ten of Swords, that's probably an indication that someone is in a more dangerous situation. If the devil and the Eight of Swords is followed by the Ace of Cups or the Two of Cups, that might be a sexy situation, you know? So the way that the cards dance together is key, and you can't know all of that until you're in the reading. You know, that's why this is a little bit hard to talk about. When I started reading, I remember getting a book called Tarot Combinations. I think it's back in that mess there. And it was meant to sort of teach us how to read cards in combinations with one another, hence the name. And that I never got through because it was like just lists of card combinations and what they might mean. And that was like another layer of stuff to memorize. And I had just spent years, 2 or 3 years, memorizing what the cards mean. It can't work that way, you know? I mean, I think like a good sexual encounter, reading the cards is a bit of a dance, and you're going to listen and you're going to take action sometimes. You're going to take the lead. You're going to then lay back and be receptive. You know, you're going to dance well together. And so there isn't any one combination of cards that would say that. But you want to look for the subtleties in it and not just say that the devil plus the moon is sex. It might be. I mean, that combination might make me think of role-playing, you know, because the moon, not just being about sexuality and attraction, like the twos, is about fantasy, you know, and so that might be there. The sun could indicate heat, you know, so I can't kind of go through and give you examples of all the card combinations. The other thing I want to warn against, too, and it's tempting, and I thought, should I talk about this? Like, there are some card combinations that I thought about and have seen that have made me think about sexual abuse being at play. Sex addiction being a factor. I mentioned the devil, for example, could indicate that. Certainly the devil in combination with maybe the Ten of Wands. I said I wasn't going to do this, and I'm doing the Ten of Wands and the Ten of Swords. Things like that, where there's a lot of heaviness, a feeling of being stuck or trapped or weighted down. Death could indicate that, might indicate an addiction. But the thing that I don't want to do, and that I ultimately decided not to get too deep into, was anything that might suggest that we are diagnosing criminal activity or mental health problems. I tend not to get powerful hits like that in readings. But there have been times where I have, probably more like sex and sex addiction kinds of things than like cancer. You know, like I don't tend to see things like that in readings, but I have seen tricky relationship stuff in the past. And the way that I do that is obliquely, because I'm not a clinician. And knowing several clinicians, I know that you have to be careful about how you address things, in part because the fact that something is happening doesn't mean that someone is ready to hear it, and that you can ignite trauma by saying the wrong thing or suggesting the wrong thing at a time when someone isn't ready to hear it. You can also contribute to whatever their wall is that's keeping them up, that's keeping them away from that realization, because it puts them on the defense. And so I try to be oblique about it if it's something that I think is a problem. And what I might say is oh, and you know, this can also mean something isn't good. And so if like you're not feeling safe, or there's something that you're worried about, like make sure that you seek assistance, or that you get in touch with your support system or whatever, you know. I don't ever diagnose or accuse. I think that is just something I'm not comfortable with. And when it comes to human sexuality, it is complicated. And when it comes to talking about that stuff, it's even more complicated. I think that people are more comfortable probably doing a tarot reading about health than about sex, because it is scary to talk about. It's hard to find the right language. You never know what might set someone off. And so the next kind of thing that I thought might be useful to bring up is like, if you're getting a reading that seems very powerfully about sex, like how do you know it's okay to talk about that if it's for someone else? If you don't know the client well enough to know whether they're comfortable hearing this kind of thing. My feeling about that, honestly, is if you are professional about it and you're not using juvenile euphemisms for things, you have to say what you see. It's our job. You know, it's what we do. Is if we're reading for someone else, we have built a contract to say the things that we see. And if you are using language that is appropriate and thoughtful, then, you know, whatever, then say it. You know, I think we have to. That's it. You know what I mean? And it's not, again, like something like this comes up so much that I'm like, oh my God, it's such a touchy subject, but it is a touchy subject for people. And we can be afraid. I think that the more afraid we are to talk about it, the more awkward we make the conversation. And if it becomes awkward for you, it is instantly going to make the person that you're reading for uncomfortable, especially if they're sitting across from you, watching you trying to parse what you have to say. And they're going to say, what are they not telling me? You know? And so I think it's better to do a situation where you are honest, you know, and you just say it. You might offer a trigger warning of some kind and say, you know, this might be a thing that makes you uncomfortable, but I feel like this is about sex or whatever. You could do that. And, you know, if it's like me where you do a lot of your videos this way, then, you know, I could say, if you're not comfortable with that, you can pause the video now and I'll read on something else for you. But I probably wouldn't even do that. I'd probably just say it. Honestly, I don't think that there's anything scary about it. If it's a situation where you are concerned about someone's safety or something in the reading feels like you, I think, would want to do what you would do in any situation where you're concerned. You would try to give them information about potential help. You know, if you are feeling in any way like X, Y, and Z, these are reputable resources, which is something really tarot readers who read face-to-face probably should have, just in case, you know, because who knows. It's a little bit easier if you're doing a video reading because you can gather and do your research after. I had a brilliant thought that's gone away, and this is why we make notes and prepare. Which I did, but I just didn't write this part down. Hopefully it'll come back to me. Yeah, I mean, sorry, it's coming back to me in little dribs, and I'm feeling very frustrated that I forgot. Yeah, I mean, I hopefully it'll come back before I end this video. If not, I'll make another video. I'm always making videos, right? I think that our job is to say what we see. I think we have to. And I think that, you know, if we act weird about it, it's going to be weird for the client. So, like, don't be weird about it. Or weirder. Those are really the big things, I think, for me. I don't, again, want to make it like every reading is about this stuff. But I think you want to listen to your cards. And I think that this is often missing from tarot. But it's a thing that is so human and so much a part of our life. Sex is a motivator. Sex is a thing we want. Sex is a thing we don't get when we want it all the time. You know, sex is like money, you know? I mean, money, food, sex are powerful, powerful motivators. And it should show up in readings sometimes. It should be part of relationship readings. It should be part of the dialogue. And I think that as tarot readers, when we're comfortable looking at the cards through that lens, and when we have a system to help us recognize and understand when that might be a piece of the reading puzzle, then we're just better prepared readers. You know, we've got that in our toolkit, which to me is like so much of being a great reader is just constantly picking up little things that might be great to put in the toolkit. It can get overwhelming. You know, you can have too much stuff and you don't want to use the wrong tool for the wrong job. But if you are present and listening to the cards most of the time, you don't need to reach for the tools. They come to you. Again, I recognize that in this context, like, the use of the word tools and reaching probably is a little questionable, but you get my point. The thing is that if you have them, if you have these resources, if you have these lessons, if you have the knowledge, most of the time I have found as a reader that when I sit down to lay out the cards, if I am present and there and listening to the question, listening to the cards, watching them dance together, then when it needs to be about sex, that will arrive in my mind. And when it's not, it won't, you know? And so that is helpful. And ways that I find it helpful to have context include using large spreads without fixed positions and, you know, being experienced, I guess. That does matter too. This takes practice. And I have found too that when I learn something new, suddenly everything becomes about that. So, like, you know, I mean, now I'll probably do readings where everything is about sex, and people will be like, whoa, dude, calm down. This is about my car. And I'm like, I don't think so. It's about a ride, but it's not about your car. That's just the kind of classy person I am. You know what I mean? So that's it. I mean, so let's summarize really quickly. How do you know when a reading is about sex or sexuality? Generally, the question is the first clue, and particularly questions about relationships and or sex. Obviously, if it's a question about sex, the reading will be about sex. But it probably will show up in relationship readings if you're open to it. So the question matters. The other thing I would say is themes in a spread or lots of numbers of sexy cards. Those are ways that I can tell that might be at play. Combinations of cards in the context of each other would certainly tell me something. And then, of course, cards that I have found over my career, I hate that word, have a sexual energy. So again, for me, those would be the Devil, the Moon, the Tower, the Empress and the Emperor, I keep saying the Magician, the Hermit, the Suit of Wands, the Court of Wands, the Suit of Cups in context with Wands, 2 cards, 3 cards, and then certain combinations of things that just have an energy about them that's fiery, that's hot, that's whatever. It sounds like a lot of cards, but again, you know, they mean a lot. So it's like, you know, Camellia Elias always says, like, cards don't mean anything. And I, you know, if you watch my channel, that I agree with that, because meaning is elastic. It depends on the context. It depends on what we're talking about. It depends on all the things. And so just because the wands might represent sexuality to me doesn't mean they always do. The wands also represent creativity and enthusiasm and energy, exercise, you know, anything that has electricity to it. So, how do I know when they are what they are? You know, I'm going to say it. Context. It's the context of the cards, the question, you at that moment, the person you're working with. Listen, and they will talk to you. I promise. And if they're not doing it now, keep going. It's not, you know, this isn't the kind of thing that you get good at overnight. And it's not the kind of thing you get good at and stay good at. If I go for a couple weeks without reading, I get rusty. It's like anything else. It needs exercise. So you need to exercise your tools. So on that note, that is my thoughts on reading tarot with a lens of sexuality. How do you handle sex in readings? I would love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you comment. Again, if you watch this and you didn't take my advice at the beginning and you think I'm a big perv, I really don't want to hear about it. I really don't want to get downvoted or reported for having a frank discussion on a channel, by the way, that I just recently marked as not made for children. Thank you, YouTube. I don't want to hear about it, but I do want to hear about how you handle this. So let's chat about that. Have a good night. Enjoy your week. Enjoy whatever sexuality you have going on right now. I don't have any. But you know, the Hermit. What are you gonna do? Have a good week. Be good. Talk soon.